So as always, throw your questions in the chat and we'll start enjoying Brianna's lecture now.
Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here speaking with you all. As Meg said, my name is Brianna Morgan. You can all call me Bree when we get to the question and answer part. So I am a gerontological nurse practitioner, and I've worked at Penn since probably 2008, and I've worked as a nurse for about 10 years now. In the FTD Center, which is part of the Memory Center, as well as in neurocritical care for a period of time, and then most recently in palliative care at the Cancer Center at Penn. And now I'm sort of coming back to the Memory Center as a doctoral student in the School of Nursing. And just as a little bit of background, my research is looking at inner strength in people recently diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment along with their care partners. But today, I'm going to talk to you about social engagement. So I just want to be clear about, our goals for today. So I have 4 main objectives. First, I'm going to define just some key terms around social engagement. And I'll do that throughout the presentation. But I'll let you know with a border at the top that says, this is one of the key terms we want to think about. I'm also going to describe the evidence for social connectedness and healthy aging, specifically with a focus on cognition. And finally, we're going to identify some ways for you to become more socially engaged. I have an activity for you all to do that we'll give you a handout for at the end. We might even be able to try to do some of that together while we're chatting at the end. And I am going to ask you to do a brief activity in this next slide on your own. You can either do it on a pen and paper next to you, or you can pull up a Word document on your computer, or really just think about it. But it's sort of a way to ground you in your own experiences. All right. So we're going to start with a key term, social networks. I think it's important to think about this. What is a social network? It's not just Facebook or the movie, but a social network is a structure. Sorry, I'm just saying yes to the recording. A social structure made up of social actors and their interactions. So what are social actors? They're people, of course, but also groups and institutions who can interact. So like a classroom, this classroom is a social actor. And an interaction is a relationship between 2 or more individuals. So any kind of social interaction has to involve more than one person. And then as you can see in this depiction here, that white dot in the center is one person. And all these black dots around with these interconnected sort of blue or purple lines are the connections that this person has socially. And you can see that there's some really dense areas where there's lots of connections and lots of interconnections that this whole group really all knows each other. But then you also see these satellite groups that are a little bit separate that might exist more in isolation. So social networks have a little bit of variability. And we develop these networks through trust, safety, reciprocity, a sense of belonging to that group, often values and norms, a participation in that group, and sometimes diversity of perspective. It brings people together. So I want you to take just a couple minutes and think about your own social network. And you can, as I said, you can just do this mentally. I think it helps to write it down. You don't have to draw out a full map like this because it can get complicated, but at least start listing out who are some of the people in your own social network. Who are some of the people who are closest to you, maybe those who are further away, satellite people. And you can also think about groups and institutions who are part of your social network. So I'm going to give you about a minute to write that down and think about your social network, and we're going to come back to it. Because I see there are a couple of people who are entered from the waiting room. For those of you who just entered, we're thinking about our own social networks and starting to draw out who all is in your own social network, either by just making a list of those people or starting to think about it as a cluster. I'm going to give you about another half a minute. Okay, so I'm going to have you start turning your attention back towards the presentation. And as I said, so we'll come back to that social network later in the presentation after we do a little bit more learning. So let's think about older adult social networks. So Megan, if you can you launch that poll question?
Yep, you should be seeing a poll pop up. Please just go ahead and answer this question for us.
Great. So I'm asking you all to think, do you think that people's networks increase, decrease, or stay the same as they age? Wow, you all are quick to answer. I love it. Let's see. Got about 3/4 of you answering. I'm going to give us another few seconds. All right, can you all can they see the poll, or should I shout out what where we've ended with
I think that it would be best if you were sharing it, just in case someone has any difficulty.
Great. So we've got about 84% of you who responded, and it looks like a pretty definitive answer. 3/4 of the people who answered, 75%, say we think that probably people's networks are decreasing. About 20% say increase, and about 7% say stay the same. All right, so I'm going to end that poll. Great. I will share the results so you all can see those. And so let's see what actually happens. So I think you'll all be unsurprised to find that social networks do change with age. But how do they change? They actually have a U-shaped change this is in the age range of like the 50s to 80s. We find that people's social networks do dip, but eventually they tend to recover and get back to that pre-dip social network number. So people's networks tend to increase in the older age. That dip, science is really trying to figure out what's happening there. There's a fair amount of hypotheses usually around, this is related to retirement or bereavement, loss of those who died. But I think the great thing about this data is that it shows that people's networks really do tend to recover. Another thing that is true about people's social networks as they age is they really tend to change. So even if they don't grow, so even that 40% of people who have no change in their network size, 80% of those people have some change in their network makeup. So even if the size of your network doesn't change, the people who are in it, the institutions who are in it will. So I think this is really helpful to know, what's normal with social networks as we age. So we should expect that there will be a dip, then an increase, and that social networks are dynamic. They're going to change over time. And that really makes sense based upon who all is in your social network at the time is very contextual. All right, so social isolation and loneliness are probably words that you all have heard quite a bit because they've been in the headlines a lot since 2017, when former Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy took up the issue in his book, Togetherness. And around that same time in the UK, they announced a Minister of Loneliness. So the government of the UK, it decided we're going to take on this issue of loneliness. So that this really started to come into the public view around that time and has stayed there, especially with the pandemic. And we often hear these words, there's an epidemic of loneliness. So I dug into the data a little bit to say, is this really happening? And it's interesting, the data is kind of mixed. That while more people are living alone, that actually what we're seeing is that loneliness hasn't actually increased over time. And there's some hypotheses as to why that might be, but perhaps what is likely happening is that it's become much more of a public phenomenon, much more in the public discourse than it has in the past. So much like mental health had a really big boom in the 80s and 90s, I think loneliness and social isolation are really having a moment where we're talking about it as a determinant of health. So let's dig into these terms a bit more. So they're actually quite different. So social isolation is a lack of social connections. For example, somebody who lives alone or maybe is unmarried, while loneliness is the subjective or perceived discrepancy between actual social connection and desired social connection. So there's sort of a mismatch there. And these terms are not mutually exclusive. For example, a person can be socially isolated, living alone, but not in fact experiencing loneliness. This was the group that they were hoping to have, which was few. And in fact, there's some studies to show that people who are living alone are actually more likely to be socially engaged with their community. And at the same time, you can also see somebody who could appear very socially connected, be married, have a large group of local family or friends, but perhaps that social network isn't exactly meeting their expectations of socialization, either because it is not functioning in the right way or it's not high quality. A good example I can think of is somebody who's a caregiver for a person with dementia, especially if that person with dementia was part of their, a key part of their social network, like a spouse. They're maybe not getting the same quality of social support from that connection, although it hasn't changed in number. And of course, we can always have people who are socially isolated and lonely. But I wanted to tease apart those two terms a bit. One way to talk about this, all of these topics at once, social network, social loneliness, and social isolation, is to think about this concept of social connectedness, which is the extent to which a person feels socially connected to others. I am a big framework person, so I'm going to give you the framework that I use to think about social connection. I like to do this because it can help us think about how our social connections are working, and then in turn helps us think about how to make it better. So social connectedness is multifactorial, including a structure, a function, and quality. Structure is what your social connections look like. For example, are you married? Are you single? Are you living alone or together with others? Do you have lots of connections or maybe just a few? Function is how your social connections work for you. So are your social connections providing you with support? Are they providing you with actionable items like grocery shopping or mowing your lawn? And then finally, quality is how well those social connections work for you. So are you in a mutually beneficial marriage or a strained one? Do you have a supportive group of friends or an exclusionary one? So all of those things impact how we perceive that social connection. So I want you to do a little thought experiment to think back to that mini social network that you started thinking about or writing down. what does the structure look like? Are there many people? Are there few? Are they diverse across a large group? How does it function? What sort of things are you getting from these social connections? And then which relationships are high quality? Are there some that are maybe not high quality? So again, by separating out these social connections, we can think about how best to improve them. For example, social isolation fits in structural factors because it indicates that there are not enough people or institutions in your social network. So then you would want to create an intervention that's focused around the structure, the number of people. Whereas loneliness fits more into the functional and quality categories because it's more about your perception of how those social networks or connections are working for you. All right, I'm going to pause for just a moment. Meg, are there any questions in the chat?
No questions. There was one person who was talking about a book called Bowling Alone, and saying that they had they appreciated kind of the author's phrasing on there.
Great. Yes, Bowling Alone is a phenomenal book. Excuse me, that really talks about how and was one of the books that really sparked this movement of loneliness. Excuse me. But really talks about, how our society has become to be more individualistic and more lonely, perhaps. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how social connectedness is linked to healthy aging and health in general. So there are two ways to think about this. First, how does being socially connected benefit my health? And then second, how does a lack of good or a number of social connections, how does that worsen my health? So we'll talk about those two things separately. First, we'll think about how having a good, healthy social connectedness improves your health. I want to focus first on the strong evidence. So what does science tell us? We've got a pretty good idea that there's a link here. So there was a great study in 2010, sort of a landmark study that was a meta-analysis, which means it combines a bunch of different studies in hundreds of thousands of participants with longitudinal data over time. And it found, which it means it's really high quality. So it found that social connectedness increases life expectancy by about 50%. This was a huge landmark finding at the time and is often quoted in the news. We also know that being more socially connected is protective against cognitive decline and cardiovascular events like heart attack and stroke. There's also an association, so not necessarily a causal link, but an association with reduced depression and anxiety. So, and then there's there's more evidence that's a little bit more moderate, which means that we just don't have as much data and as much quality data to support these claims. But we have a pretty good idea that there's a link at this point. So there's an association with increased quality of life, improved physical health, and less physical debility, regardless of your ability status at the beginning. So even if you're a person with less functional capability, you're able to maintain it longer with more social connections. We also know that high quality and more numerous or varied relationships are key drivers in the positive effects of social engagement. All right, so now let's take that on the flip side. Let's talk about how social disconnectedness impacts health in a negative way. And again, we'll look at strong evidence and then moderate evidence. So the same researchers who did that meta-analysis in 2010 did another one in 2015 that found that social deficits or social disconnectedness were associated with a higher risk of mortality. But it was actually less of a decline, or it was not as much of an effect as the previous study. So this was on the order of 25 to 30%. So people who had fewer social connections or more social deficits had a 25 to 30% higher risk of mortality. We also see very similarly that there's substantial evidence that links social disconnection with increased risk for dementia by about 50%. There's also a strong association with accelerated cognitive decline in general. And there's this kind of tricky, possibly bi-directional relationship that dementia predisposes an individual to feelings of loneliness. And then caregivers for persons with dementia are at a greater risk of loneliness because the quality of that relationship has changed. There's significant evidence that links social disconnection with a risk for heart disease and stroke. And then there's strong associations with depression and anxiety. Though not all people who are depressed and anxious are lonely. There's evidence that the quality of social connection may be more important than the quantity for people who are depressed or anxious. And then we have some moderate evidence that shows that there's an increased risk of chronic illness, such as diabetes or high cholesterol, an increased risk for physical debility due to illness. And there's preliminary evidence linking social disconnection with decreased quality of life, and also associations with riskier health behaviors, such as smoking or alcohol use, and a higher incidence of elder abuse. And those sort of things, those riskier health behaviors can have sort of a snowball effect that, once somebody is socially isolated or lonely, they may engage in these less healthy behaviors. So we don't quite know which came first, the chicken or the egg in this scientific question. But I do want to point out that even though it looks like there are more things that being socially disconnected impacts health for the negative, there's actually appears to be more benefit from being socially connected than there is deficit from being socially disconnected. So thinking about that, you get a 50% boost in mortality from being socially connected, but only a 30% decline in mortality from being socially disconnected. So I like to think about this as sort of a positive way, that what we really want to do is foster good social connections. So now we're all in agreement, social connectedness is important to our health. What can we do about it? So social engagement is another one of our key terms, and it's one's degree of participation in community or society. So in order to be socially engaged, you need to be doing something, doing some sort of activity. Interacting again, so there needs to be at least two people. And there needs to be a social exchange, which involves giving or receiving something from others without compulsion. So that means that you can't be getting paid to do this work. And in some studies, they exclude family obligations since that's compulsory. But that doesn't mean that you can't get social connectedness from family involvement, or even being at work, but that the engagement that you're doing isn't one that you're compensated for. So I want you all to take a moment and write in the chat some examples of social engagement. And Linda, I see a question about, is this increased morality or mortality? Increased mortality, so an increased risk of death. All right, Meg, are you seeing any of the chats coming through?
Yeah, I saw a walking group, a knitting group, sharing a meal with friends, church affiliations, taking classes.
Excellent, that's great. That's exactly the kind of social engagement we're talking about. So I want to talk about how to improve our social engagement. But first, I just want to acknowledge that social engagement can be really challenging to initiate and to continue, especially when we're in a global pandemic. So I want to give everybody just, like a little bit of grace here and also be thinking about that when we're setting goals, is to try to make sure that they're realistic and we're not setting ourselves up for these really lofty expectations of what our social network should look like. And I also want to use the evidence to think of what kind of social engagement is most beneficial. What's going to be the biggest bang for our buck? So the evidence really tells us that we want to spend time fostering high quality relationships and diverse relationships that meet our needs across multiple areas. So think back to the social networks that you were writing down or thinking about in the beginning. Where are your high quality relationships? That might be a spouse, it could be a good friend. I think about this as somebody who just really gets you without much explanation. You don't really have to work too hard to be with them. And then you also want to think about the diversity in your relationships. So my husband and I always joke that your spouse can't meet all your needs. I have nursing friends. I'm a new parent, so I have all these new parent friends. And as a PhD student, I now have a social group that supports me as a PhD student. So I have this variety of social networks that meets my needs across the areas of interest that I have. So I think it's really important for us to have that diversity in relationships. The way my father-in-law put it, I asked him to describe his social connections, and he said, he says, I have one person for my everyday life, that's my spouse. And then I have close friends for specific shared activities. And I liked that description as well. And we also know from the evidence that these connections will shift over time. So it's okay if you, when you were a person who was working, had a lot of work friends, it's okay if those friends dwindle. Maybe you keep some of the really high quality ones, but not all of them. And then you develop new friends, perhaps people you'll meet on the pickleball court in retirement. And like, for example, as a new parent, I've made all these new friends that I didn't have or need before. So next, we want to identify something that you're actually going to do, because there's no benefit in saying like do this social engagement if it isn't something you're going to continue to do. So I created a mnemonic. What's more fun than doing something messy? I know it's not spelled right, but it gets all the things that we need in there. So this acronym helps you to remember the type of activities that you're most likely to engage with. First, identify something that's meaningful. People are much more likely to engage in activities that provide meaning and help them tap into a greater purpose. This is going to vary based on your personal values. For example, for some folks, that may be spending time with grandkids, while others, it's creating art, making music. So it's really individual. Next, you want to identify is social engagement that's easy or convenient. You're much less likely to do something that takes you a ton of effort to do, whether it's like a long car ride or even just something like outside of your community that you have to put in a lot of effort to do. You're less likely to continue to do that. You also want to find a partner to share the load. We know that friends and family can exert social pressure, so we're going to use that to our advantage. You can have a friend or a spouse or a family member who agrees to engage in an activity with you, or even just keep you accountable and check in with you and say, hey, have you been going to that knitting group? You'll be much more likely to do it. Research also shows that people are more likely to do service-oriented activities since it taps into that meaning piece and also really reminds people of their value to society, that you're doing something to give back. And finally, I think maybe most importantly, is to find something that you actually enjoy and is really fun. This might link to meaning for you, but it might not. It might just be, I just really enjoy doing this. Okay, so now I want to give you some steps for how to get engaged and stay engaged. The first, you may not think of this, but you might want to talk to your healthcare provider about ways to get engaged. It's actually really come full circle and come into healthcare's view that this is an important part of being a healthy well human being, especially in the UK, they've embraced this concept called social prescribing, where a provider will actually write a person a prescription and say, you know, I noticed your weight is going up, but we also know that there's such benefits to being socially engaged. So what I'd like you to do is join a group walking group, rather than talking maybe about a medication or a medical intervention. So social interaction as medicine is something that you can talk to your healthcare provider about. Next, you want to identify local resources. I'm going to go through a few examples, and we're going to give you a handout with all of these examples on it for you to peruse at your own in your own time. And then next, what you're going to do is make a plan that includes an achievable goal that is measurable and achievable over time. And like I said before, this can be really tough to do. So I always think it's a good idea to set kind of a low goal and hope, or at least a realistic goal that you'll meet and be glad when you go above and beyond. As with before, we're going to identify someone who will keep you to it, keep track of your progress, and then link it to reward. So those are all ways that we know will help us continue to do behavior. And I'm actually borrowing a lot of these tips from behavioral economics. Okay, we're going to do an activity at the end, and we're starting to get there. So I wanted to go over a few ideas of some resources that might help you with social engagement and might help you as you create this plan to improve your social engagement. So first is local area agencies on aging. Every county in the Philadelphia area has its own local area agency on aging. In Philadelphia, it's called Philadelphia Corporation for Aging, and I've given you the website here. But you can also just Google your county and area agency on aging. I know Bucks, Delaware, Chester County, Montgomery County all have their own local areas on aging with a ton of resources. They typically, the goals are to keep older folks happy and healthy in their communities. And that might include things like home care, meal delivery services. In Philly, they run all of the senior centers. And they also have a lot of caregiver resources on their website. They all almost always have a phone number you can call to talk to a human and say, hey, I'm looking for some opportunities for social engagement. What would you recommend? The Alzheimer's Association, even if you're a person who has expected cognition, there's a ton of resources here that focus on healthy aging and healthy cognition, including social engagement. The Memory Center, which you all know, has so many phenomenal resources, including opportunities like this, which are social engagement. So I just wanted to point that out here. I wrote down a few examples of community living organizations. This isn't for everybody for either financial reasons or personal reasons, but some people as they age prefer to live in a setting that's sort of set up for aging folks. And I just gave you some names of types of communities so you can look at them on their own. For example, like a naturally occurring retirement community may not be something you've heard of before, but is like a place that's not necessarily set up to be a retirement community, but just sort of happens that way. And then there are resources that get pulled in. For example, William Penn House in Philly, which is on Chestnut Street, is a naturally occurring retirement community. And finally, there are a number of coalitions that are focused on social isolation and loneliness and have some resources as well. I also wanted to pull together, so I use my own professional network and put out to the gerontology Twitter space and said, what are you all doing for social engagement? And or what are you recommending to patients or older adults in general? So I pulled together a list of some Philly specific opportunities for social engagement, but also some that are not location specific. So I'll just point out an example here. Penn Palooza It's something that started during COVID as an opportunity for folks to sign up for a virtual pen pal to help combat the social isolation and loneliness that has come with the pandemic. And I just want to point out that even if you have a robust social network and social connections, I think that this is where the changes you can think about making are how do you engage others? And I think that's a really good example of, I'm going to do this. It again gives that sense of purpose of meaning. I'm going to engage with somebody else who might be experiencing some loneliness. Excuse me. Okay, so we're getting to the part where I want to show you a social engagement action plan. So this is a handout that I'm going to give you at the end of this to help you create your own action plan of how to improve your social engagement. So first, I want you to think about a description of what you'd like to change. It can be anything. I'll give you an example in a moment. And then I want you to think about where does it fit in that structure? So or in that social connectedness framework? Is it a structure piece? Is it related to function? Is it related to quality? Then think about what are the resources that could help me address this? And then make a plan. What are you going to change? I want that plan to be something that's measurable and actionable. And then you want to think about, is it messy? Does it meet one of these boxes? At least one. It doesn't have to meet everything, but at least one sort of messy category. Who is your accountability partner? And then how do you define success? So that helps you figure out, what is the measurable component of this? How will I know that I did this? And then again, to borrow from behavioral economics, always helps to give yourself a reward at the end of it or along the way. So let me give you an example of an action plan. All right, let's see. So I'm going to say my social network is much smaller since the pandemic. Many of my friends have moved out of the city into the suburbs. I haven't stayed as connected with a lot of folks. It's been kind of a wild time. So I want to work on increasing my social network. This is part of the structure component of social connectedness because it's about the number of connections I have. All right, what resources do I have? I looked around my neighborhood. I realized there's this great neighborhood message board in one of the community centers near where I live. And I saw that there was a walking group that meets in my neighborhood at a convenient time for me once a week. So what am I going to change? I'm going to join this local walking group with my neighbor. So let's see where it fits in with the messy category. It is easy because it is local. I don't have to go too far. It's a convenient time. It's shared because I'm going to do it with my neighbor. And it's also enjoyable. I love going for a walk. It really works for me, helps me clear my head, get ready for the day. My neighbor is going to be my accountability partner. She is also a new parent and has also been wanting to meet a goal of walking more and getting more socially engaged. So we're going to keep each other on track. All right, how do I define success? I'm going to set a kind goal to myself. I'm going to attend this walking group at least 6 times in 6 months. So I'm going to give myself, this is a half a year plan. I'd like to go at least once a month. It's okay if that, it's more clustered in the beginning based on my needs, but it gives me flexibility, but still something to achieve. And then I'm going to couple it with a reward. So each time I go on this walk, I'm going to go by my local coffee shop and get myself a fancy tea because I deserve it and did a great thing for myself. So you can see how that is pulls together all these sort of techniques to come up with a plan to get me more socially engaged, and we'll keep it going. So again, these are the tools that I want you to use, this structure, social connection framework and the messy goals to create an action plan. We're going to give those to you. And we can take a pause now for some discussion and questions, and even maybe some brainstorming of some ideas you all have for some changes and some action plans that you might make. All right, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can come back together. And do the part where we actually get to talk to each other. So Meg, before I open it up, are there any questions in the chat?
So I'll actually be taking some questions. This is Sharnita. You guys have seen me a few times in other programs as well. So if you have any questions, you can actually send those to me.
I see, and thank you to those of you who pointed out that on the slide it said morality and not mortality. So apologies for that spelling error. We'll try to make that change if we send these slides around.
Also, I just gave everyone the ability to unmute themselves. So if anyone wanted to unmute themselves and ask their questions, they can go ahead and do that as well.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can, go ahead.
How does this work with people who are introverts? Because a lot of this is, you know, socializing with people, but if you're an introvert and you don't want to, or you're not comfortable, how does this affect your life expectancy?
Such a great question. And I actually dug into this question a little bit. I was curious as well. So what the evidence shows us is that even introverts tend to be socially engaged, but they tend to live more in the quality than the quantity type of social engagement. So maybe they don't have a huge diverse group of social engagements, but they have a small cluster of people who are really important, meaningful connections. And just having that small quality relationships provides the health benefits that having this big diverse group of social relationships. And in fact, in some cases, like the depression, anxiety, health benefits are improved with quality relationships over quantity. And the other piece that I would say is that a big piece of social connectedness is about perception. So it's about finding the right balance for what you want and what you perceive as the right amount of social connection with what you actually have. So for somebody who's an introvert, that might be fewer social engagements, but with a higher quality connections. Does that answer your question okay?
Yes, yes, it does.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great question. So I'll just remind everyone that you can type your questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just ask them out loud.
What do you say about, since the pandemic has been so prevalent in all our lives, that has caused a lot of disconnection? How do you go about that? Because a lot of seniors are afraid, you know, they're afraid to have visitors, they're afraid to go out. So what do you say about that?
I think that has been such a tough part of this past, year and a half plus is, this thing that we know has great benefits for our health, has become dangerous. And so it's a big topic of conversation. Essentially, we're like in the middle of this, for better or for worse, like experiment of us all having fewer physical relationships right now. I think for me, it's about finding a balance and making, I follow a group called Dear Pandemic, which is a bunch of female scientists who provide a lot of accurate information about the pandemic. And one of the things they talk about is creating smart activity. So that means that there's space. So you're maybe outside, that I'm not going to get all of them correct, that it's only for a short period of time, that there's a lot of good airflow, that you're wearing masks if masks are appropriate, and that you try to keep social contacts in that way, where you can still engage, but try to keep it as safe and reducing the risk of transmission and exposure to a minimum. But I think that especially now that there's vaccination options and options for boosters, we're getting to the point where there are safer options for engaging socially. And I like to use that SMART framework as, when I am able to socially engage, how can I do it in a way that feels safe from a COVID perspective? So it's really important to find those balances, and then finding other ways of living in this social, virtual space that still give you a quality connection with somebody, whether it's, doing a Zoom or FaceTime with groups.
Thank you.
Great question. I wish I had a better answer. That one's a tough one. At least I always think,